Well, thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon to everybody. So for 700 years now, Exeter has been turning out undergraduates and graduates, and in those 700 years, for 550 of those 700 years, India or China have been the largest economy in the world. And the Chinese believe that the 150 years in between 1817 and 1914 was a period which was an aberration in world history. And as Hamish suggested, sometime this year, using purchasing power parity basis, China will once again become the largest economy in the world. Incidentally, India was the largest economy in the world until the 14th century. Somewhere between the 1300 and 1400, China overtook India. So it may even have been in 1314, who knows? But the point that I want to make is that the story about what's happening in the world economy, is actually much more than just China and India. And it's much more than just economics. In fact, if you look at convergence of incomes, 89 countries now are converging very rapidly. That is, they have per capita income growth, which is 3 percentage points above that of the United States. And that's been happening for the last decade. And this convergence has been accelerating. And what is more, the lowest income countries have been accelerating the fastest in terms of convergence. So there's some very interesting patterns that are taking place. Secondly, there's convergence not just in incomes, there's convergence in levels of education. So for example, now I think in your Hume lecture, Rector, you talked about 135 million, this was in 2009, 135 million graduates of tertiary education institutions in the world in 2009. Well, between now and 2030, China will be producing 200 million tertiary education graduates. And if you think that if you think that the quality of their education institutions are not quite up to the standards of Oxford, perhaps, right now, 42 universities in China are in the top 500 universities of the world, more than the United Kingdom. Only second only to the United States. So they're catching up not just in terms of quality, but they're catching up in terms of quantity. Third, what about military expenditures? There's a very high correlation between the aggregate wealth of a country and the amount that it spends on the military. In fact, the correlation coefficient is about 0.7. And as the aggregate wealth of China has been increasing, so has its military expenditures. And right now, very rapidly, there are systems that they're developing, whether they're Aegis destroyers, whether they're unmanned aerial vehicles, whether they're anti-satellite weaponry, whether they're either carriers or carrier killers. They are rapidly expanding their military capabilities. They now believe they can deny access to US forces up to the first island chain, which is Japan, Taiwan, and so forth, and might even be up to the second island chain, which is well into the Pacific by the year 2020 or 2030. So there's rapid expansion as well in military capability. What does all this mean? What are the fact that there is this rapid convergence, and how does all this affect the world? Very quickly, the first way I believe that it affects the world is it's made the world a multipolar world. It's no longer a unipolar world. And the absence of a hegemon and the presence now of competing powers in the world has made decisions with respect to global governance extremely difficult, whether it's financial stability, whether it's introducing an international system to maintain financial stability has been extremely problematic, whether it's trade, whether it's climate change. Anything that requires global collective action has become much more complicated now than it was 15, 20 years ago. And that's the first big implication that we've seen. The second big implication, and I don't think people appreciate this very much, is that with the rise of 200 million new entrants into the white-collar workforce of the world, you will have the same impact as you had when the unskilled workers of China became globalized, it became part of the blue-collar workers. So you had a decline in the real wage rate of blue-collar workers across the world, and you had rising inequality. My submission to you is that now, going forward, you will have a depressive effect on white-collar real remuneration in the advanced countries. So, and of course, with India becoming part of the globalized labor force, the pressure on blue-collar workers will remain. So there's going to be rising inequality. So Piketty was absolutely right. He didn't actually put down in his book what were the channels for inequality increases, but this is going to be one very important channel. Other channels are technology and things of that nature. But yes, I think the introduction of these very large economies into the global system is going to have a big impact on inequality. So that's a second big impact that I would point to. Now the third big impact is actually the result of a combination of convergence in incomes, technology, and the fact that there's just so much more in the world in terms of countries, goods, products, services, and actors. There is much greater mobility of ideas, technology, people, and there is a mentality, a change in mentality as the middle classes have grown. By 2020, most of the world's middle class will be Asian, and most Asians will be middle class. And as a result, Asians are demanding better governance, so they're putting much greater pressure on their governments. They no longer want performance, they no longer want pedigree, they want performance. Yesterday, Modi was elected as the Prime Minister of India with the biggest majority that we've seen in an extremely long time, perhaps the biggest majority ever. I haven't done the numbers yet. 279 out of 543 seats, right? And we are likely to see Joko Widodo, who's the governor of Jakarta, become the next president of Indonesia when they go through the election on July the 9th in Indonesia. And these are both individuals who have promised to deliver public services, better government, and they are not sort of ideological, they don't belong to the historical past, and this is primarily the result of the forces of the middle class demanding better public services and better government. They want better performance. So this growth has not just having an impact on the world, it's having an impact on these very countries. And the rise of the middle class and the rise of access to technology and the rise of the internet has led to a new range of global actors who are actually outside the traditional centers of power, whether those centers of power were the government, the bureaucracy, or large corporations. We now have upstarts, we have startups, we have insurgents, we have hackers, we have activists, and all of these groups are imposing constraints on the traditional centers of power. There's a marvelous book that's been brought out by a colleague of mine, Moises Naim. And Moises Naim, the book is called The End of Power. But it's not quite the end of power, it's the decay of power. So this is not just the fact that you have large numbers of developing countries that are beginning to impose a restriction on the power of the advanced countries. You actually have right across the world developments that are affecting power globally, whether they're at the international level, whether it's at the national level. And increasingly now, leaders of countries are being constrained in the way they can apply power. So let's take Modi, who's just become the Prime Minister. There's enormous hope that he can get things done, but India is a federalist country. He has to not only come up with good ideas, he's got to bring along all the state chief ministers in India, right? And frankly, they have a significant amount of power and they are responsible for a large amount of the public services that the Indian government has to deliver within India. So he has a big job ahead of him. He's not as powerful as people think he is. So power has dissipated, and this is not just something in India, but this is something that's happened globally. Even Barack Obama, who people consider to be the most powerful man in the world, has found himself constrained in introducing the very basic legislation that he had been elected to provide. So this is something that's global. So just to quickly summarize, it's been 700 years since Exeter came into existence, right? In 1314, there was, in the 14th century, after Exeter came into existence, there was the Black Death that occurred. There was the 100 Years' War that had started. Gunpowder had been just invented, right? And right now, we face equally big challenges. They've just changed. The challenges have changed, but they remain just as big, despite the passage of 700 years. So thank you very much.
Well done.